Crash and discovery. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. The only sound came from the soft hum of Dr. Ethan Hayes' rover as it moved across the rocky terrain of the remote planet. Ethan was a human medic stationed on Halora 7, a forgotten world far from Earth. He had spent the last 3 years running a small medical outpost, treating miners and explorers who occasionally passed through. Tonight, though, he was alone, heading back to his outpost after delivering supplies to a nearby settlement. Suddenly, the silence shattered. A loud, roaring sound tore through the sky, followed by a streak of light that blazed across the horizon. Ethan hit the brakes, staring at the fiery object hurtling toward the ground. It wasn't a meteor. The flames were a strange greenish blue, and the object's shape didn't look natural. What the hell was that? Ethan muttered to himself, his heart pounding. The object crashed in the distance with a deafening boom, sending a shockwave that shook the ground beneath his rover. Smoke and fire lit up the dark landscape, creating an eerie glow. Ethan hesitated for a moment. Whatever had fallen wasn't human, or at least it didn't look like any human spacecraft he had ever seen. His logical side told him to stay away, but his instincts as a medic kicked in. Someone, or something, might need help. With a deep breath, Ethan steered his rover toward the crash site. The closer he got, the more unnatural the scene became. The wreckage was scattered across the rocky ground, pieces of twisted metal, and glowing debris still smoldering. In the center of it all was the remains of a small ship, its design sleek and alien. Symbols etched into the metal pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. Ethan grabbed his medkit and stepped out of the rover. The air smelled of burnt metal and chemicals, making him cough. His boots crunched against the debris as he carefully approached the wreck. He scanned the area, his flashlight cutting through the smoke. That's when he saw her. She was lying near the ship, half buried under a piece of shattered hull. Her skin was pale, with a faint bluish tint, and her long silver hair shimmered even in the dim light. She wore a form-fitting suit that was torn and scorched, revealing wounds that bled a dark, almost iridescent liquid. She wasn't human, there was no doubt about that, but her fragile form and the pained expression on her face made her seem all too real. Ethan crouched beside her, his hands trembling slightly. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing pupils that glowed faintly like stars. She tried to speak, but her words were a strange, melodic language he didn't understand. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know what you're saying, but I'm here to help." With a grunt of effort, she lifted her hand and grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so injured. Then, in a shaky voice, she said a single word in English. "Help." That was all Ethan needed to hear. "All right, hang in there," he said, quickly assessing her injuries. She had a deep gash on her side, and what looked like a broken leg. Her breathing was shallow, and her pulse was weak. Time was running out. Using his medkit, Ethan stabilized her wounds as best as he could. The alien girl winced but didn't cry out, her glowing eyes fixed on him. "You're going to be okay," Ethan said, more to reassure himself than her. As he worked, a strange noise made him pause. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere behind him. Ethan's stomach tightened. Slowly, he turned his head, his flashlight beam sweeping across the wreckage. Shadows flickered in the smoke, and for a moment, he thought he saw movement, something crawling, something large. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't abandon the girl. "We've got to get out of here," he said, his voice tense. He carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but the effort still made his muscles strain. He carried her back to the rover, his heart pounding with every step. The growling sound grew louder, and now he was certain. Something was following them. He didn't dare look back. All he could do was move as fast as he could without dropping her. Reaching the rover, Ethan placed her gently in the passenger seat and climbed in. He slammed the door shut and started the engine, the hum of the rover drowning out the growls for a moment. As the vehicle sped away from the crash site, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the smoke and flames, he saw dark shapes moving, hulking, shadowy figures that seemed almost animal-like, yet disturbingly intelligent. "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" Ethan muttered under his breath. The alien girl stood beside him, her glowing eyes meeting his. Despite her injuries, there was something in her gaze, a mixture of fear and determination. Ethan didn't know who she was or why she was here, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning of a much larger adventure. As the rover disappeared into the night, the shadows at the crash site grew bolder, their growls turning into howls. Whatever they were, they wouldn't stop until they found her, and Ethan had just made himself their next target. The pursuit. Ethan's rover sped across the barren terrain, its headlights cutting through the endless darkness of Halora 7. The alien girl, Lyran, as she weakly whispered her name, lay slumped in the passenger seat, her breathing shallow but steady. Every so often, she'd stir, her glowing eyes flickering open to scan her surroundings. Even in her fragile state, there was an unspoken urgency about her. Ethan glanced at her, gripping the wheel tighter. "Lyran, is someone chasing you?" he asked, unsure if she understood him. She nodded faintly, her silver hair falling over her face. Her lips moved, forming words in her melodic, alien tongue, but Ethan couldn't make sense of them. Frustrated, he tapped the small translator device clipped to his belt. "Come on, work," he muttered. The device hummed to life, catching fragments of her speech. "Hunters. Tracking me. Must hide." Ethan's stomach dropped. Hunters. That explained the growling sounds at the crash site. Whoever, or whatever, they hadn't given up. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see glowing eyes or shadowy figures pursuing them. The horizon was clear, but the unease in his gut remained. "We'll be safe at my outpost," Ethan assured her, though he wasn't entirely sure if he believed it himself. The outpost was a small, fortified structure, but it wasn't built to withstand anything more dangerous than a sandstorm. If these hunters were armed and determined, they'd be in trouble. As if on cue, the rover's proximity alarm began to beep. Ethan frowned and tapped the console. What now? A blip appeared on the screen, trailing them from a distance. The alarm wasn't picking up wildlife. It was something mechanical. A drone, maybe. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, increasing the rover's speed. The rocky terrain made the ride bumpy, and the rover's suspension groaned in protest. Lyran winced, gripping the seat with her slender fingers. "Sorry," he said, glancing at her. "I'll try to make this quick." The blip on the screen grew closer, and soon, a high-pitched whirring sound became audible. Ethan craned his neck to see a sleek, insect-like drone zooming toward them. Its metallic body glinted under the starlight, and its single red eye blinked ominously. "Great, just what we needed," Ethan muttered. He swerved the rover sharply, hoping to shake the drone. But it was fast, too fast. A sharp buzzing sound filled the air as the drone fired a burst of energy, striking the ground near the rover. Sparks and debris flew, and Ethan cursed under his breath. Lyran's eyes widened. She sat up slightly, her voice urgent. "They won't stop until they take me." "Not happening," Ethan growled. His hands flew across the control panel, activating the rover's defensive systems. A small turret rose from the roof, swiveling to lock onto the drone. Come on," he muttered as the targeting system beeped. The turret fired, sending a streak of plasma toward the drone. The shot missed by inches, but it was enough to make the drone swerve and hesitate. Ethan took the opportunity to veer the rover off the main path, heading toward a canyon in the distance. The drone recovered quickly, resuming its pursuit. This time, it fired directly at the rover, and the vehicle jolted as a panel on its side was struck. "We're not gonna last long at this rate," Ethan said, glancing at Lyran. "You said they're tracking you. How?" Lyran hesitated, then pointed weakly at her arm. Ethan's eyes followed her gesture to a faint, glowing mark on her wrist. "A tracker," she said, her voice strained. "It's inside me." Ethan groaned. "Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be?" He swerved the rover again, narrowly avoiding another blast from the drone. "Can I remove it?" She nodded, her expression serious. "If you don't, they'll find us." Ethan's mind raced. Removing a tracker embedded in alien biology wasn't exactly in his skill set, but he didn't have much of a choice. "All right," he said. "Hold on." He slammed on the brakes, bringing the rover to a sudden halt. The drone zipped past them, momentarily thrown off by the abrupt stop. Ethan jumped out of his seat, grabbed his medkit, and climbed into the passenger side where Lyran sat. "This is gonna hurt," he warned her, already searching for the surgical tools he'd need. Lyran nodded, her glowing eyes full of trust. Ethan worked quickly, using a scalpel to make a small incision near the glowing mark. The tracker was a tiny metallic chip, pulsing faintly with energy. Ethan carefully extracted it, his hand steady despite the tension. As soon as the tracker was out, its glow faded. "Done," he said, holding up the chip. Lyran looked relieved, but there was no time to celebrate. The drone, realizing they'd stopped, turned around and sped toward them. Ethan jumped back into the driver's seat, tossing the tracker out the window as he floored the accelerator. The rover roared back to life, kicking up dust as it sped away. The drone, now locked onto the discarded tracker, fired at it, causing a small explosion that lit up the night. "Let's hope that buys us some time," Ethan said, glancing at Lyran. She managed a faint smile, but her exhaustion was evident. As the rover disappeared into the darkness, Ethan knew the danger was far from over. Whoever was hunting Lyran wouldn't stop, and now he was caught in the middle of it. But one thing was clear: he wasn't going to let them take her. The pursuit was only just beginning. First contact and understanding. The sun had barely risen over the jagged peaks of Halora 7 when Ethan pulled his battered rover into the garage of his outpost. The structure was a squat, reinforced dome of steel and concrete, equipped to handle storms and wild animals, but hardly suited for the kind of danger he now faced. The distant whine of the drone had faded, and for the first time in hours, the silence felt oppressive. Ethan glanced at Lyran as he powered down the rover. Her silver hair clung to her face, damp with sweat, and her breathing was shallow. She was losing strength. Without wasting a second, he grabbed her carefully, carrying her into the medical bay. The outpost was as Spartan as they came. One main room with a few cots, a compact medical station, and a small command console that flickered with outdated software. Ethan laid Lyran on the nearest cot and immediately got to work. He sterilized her wounds, applied a healing gel to the gash on her side, and set her broken leg with a lightweight splint. Her blood, a shimmering blue-green, seeped through the bandages, reminding him just how alien she was. As he worked, Lyran stirred, her glowing eyes fluttering open. "You saved me," she said in broken English, her voice soft but steady. Ethan paused, surprised. "You understand me?" She nodded faintly. "Learn your words from listening." Ethan frowned, grabbing his translator device and clipping it to his collar. "This might make things easier," he said. The device crackled as it adjusted to her language, then translated his words into a series of melodic tones. Lyran's expression brightened, and she responded in her own tongue, her words coming through the device as clear English. "You risked your life for me," she said. "Why?" Ethan shrugged, sitting down on the edge of the cot. "I'm a medic. It's what I do. But I won't lie. I've got a lot of questions." He gestured toward her. "Who are you? And why are those things hunting you?" Lyran hesitated, her glowing eyes narrowing as if she were weighing her options. Finally, she spoke. "I am Lyran from the Alchar system. My people, we are at war. A sickness spreads among us, killing our kind faster than we can fight. Our leaders sought help from other worlds, but no one would aid us." Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. So you came here looking for a cure? Liren shook her head. Not exactly. I stole something. She reached into a hidden compartment on her suit and pulled out a small cylindrical device. It pulsed faintly with a soft golden light. This contains a biological sample, a key to creating a cure. But the ones who sent those hunters don't want my people to survive. They want us to vanish. Ethan stared at the device, the weight of her words sinking in. Let me guess, he said, his voice grim. They're not going to stop until they get that back. She nodded. They will destroy anyone who helps me. You are in danger now, too. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Figures. I couldn't just have a quiet night for once, could I? He stood and began pacing. All right, if we're going to survive, we need a plan. My outpost isn't exactly a fortress, and we can't stay here forever. Do you have any idea who's after you? Liren's expression darkened. Mercenaries, ruthless and well-paid. They are loyal to no one but credits. As if on cue, a loud clang echoed through the outpost, followed by a low guttural growl. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. He grabbed the small plasma pistol from his belt and motioned for Liren to stay down. Stay quiet, he whispered. The growling grew louder, and soon the sound of heavy footsteps reverberated through the walls. Ethan crept toward the window, peeking outside. His stomach sank. A hulking figure clad in black armor stood near the entrance, scanning the area with a glowing visor. Behind it, smaller, more agile creatures darted in and out of the shadows. Biomechanical hounds, their jaws glinting with sharp metallic teeth. Fantastic, Ethan muttered under his breath. He turned back to Liren. They found us. Can you fight? Liren sat up, wincing in pain. Not well. My strength is limited. Ethan considered his options. The outpost had basic defenses, a few automated turrets, and an emergency lockdown system. But against mercenaries and their drones, it wouldn't hold for long. All right, he said, his mind racing. Here's the plan. I'll activate the lockdown to buy us time. Then we'll use the back tunnel to escape. Liren nodded. What about the hunters? Ethan managed a faint smile. We'll have to get creative. He sprinted to the command console, typing in the lockdown code. The doors slammed shut, and metal shutters sealed the windows. Outside, the mercenaries began pounding on the walls, their weapons firing bursts of energy that sizzled against the reinforced steel. Move, Ethan shouted, helping Liren to her feet. She leaned heavily on him as they made their way to the back of the outpost. The tunnel entrance was hidden beneath a supply crate, leading to a narrow passage that snaked through the rocky terrain. As they descended into the darkness, the sounds of the mercenaries breaking in echoed behind them. They'll follow us, Liren said, her voice tense. Ethan nodded. Let them. I've got a few surprises waiting for them. As the two disappeared into the tunnel, the mercenaries breached the outpost, only to trigger a series of traps Ethan had hastily set. Explosions rocked the structure, sending debris flying. But Ethan knew it wouldn't stop them for long. The hunt was far from over. Escape from the outpost. The air in the narrow escape tunnel was damp and cold, filled with the faint metallic tang of minerals embedded in the rock. Ethan led the way, gripping his flashlight tightly as its beam danced across the jagged walls. Behind him, Liren limped along, leaning on him for support. Her breathing was labored, but she pushed forward with determination. The sounds of destruction echoed faintly from above, where the outpost had become a battlefield. Ethan knew the traps he'd set wouldn't hold the mercenaries for long. They were relentless and well-equipped, and it was only a matter of time before they realized where he and Liren had gone. We're almost out, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the crunch of gravel underfoot. The tunnel opens up into the canyon ahead. Once we're there, we'll figure out our next move. Liren nodded weakly. I owe you. More than I can say. Ethan shook his head. Save it. Let's just make it out alive first. The tunnel sloped upward, the air growing colder as they approached the exit. A faint light filtered in from ahead, but it was dim and gray, the first rays of dawn struggling to pierce the thick clouds that always hung over Halora 7. As they emerged from the tunnel, the landscape stretched out before them. The canyon was vast and desolate, its rocky walls towering high on either side. Sparse vegetation clung to the edges of cliffs, and a narrow, winding path led deeper into the gorge. Ethan scanned the area, his eyes narrowing. It was quiet. Too quiet. "We need to keep moving," he said, guiding Lyran toward the path. "They'll figure out we used the tunnel soon enough." Lyran hesitated, glancing back toward the tunnel. "They are not ordinary hunters," she said softly. "They won't stop. Not until they take the sample." Ethan glanced at the cylindrical device she held tightly in her hand. It pulsed faintly, its golden glow casting eerie shadows on the rocks. "That thing better be worth it," he muttered. "It is more than worth it," Lyran replied, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "It is hope." Ethan nodded, but before he could respond, a faint whirring sound caught his attention. His blood ran cold. He turned, squinting into the sky, and his heart sank. A small reconnaissance drone hovered just above the canyon wall, its red eye blinking ominously. "They found us," he said through gritted teeth. "We need to go. Now." He grabbed Lyran's arm, pulling her forward as the drone emitted a loud, high-pitched tone. The sound reverberated through the canyon, a signal that would undoubtedly bring the mercenaries straight to them. They moved as quickly as they could, Ethan supporting Lyran's weight as they stumbled down the rocky path. The sound of engines roared in the distance, and soon, dark shapes appeared on the horizon. The mercenaries' hovercrafts were closing in, their sleek, predatory designs slicing through the air like knives. "Get down," Ethan shouted, pulling Lyran behind a large boulder just as the hovercrafts opened fire. Bolts of energy sizzled past them, scorching the rocks and sending debris flying. Ethan cursed under his breath, pulling his plasma pistol from its holster. "Stay here," he told Lyran. "I'll draw their fire." Before she could protest, he darted out from behind the boulder, firing a few shots at the nearest hovercraft. His aim wasn't perfect, but it was enough to force the pilot to veer off course. The other hovercrafts adjusted their trajectory, focusing on him. "Come on, you bastards," Ethan muttered, sprinting toward a narrow crevice in the canyon wall. The hovercrafts followed, their energy weapons lighting up the ground around him. He dove into the crevice just as another blast struck the rock, showering him with dust and fragments. Back at the boulder, Lyran clutched the sample tightly, her glowing eyes scanning the chaos. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but she knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. Ethan was buying her time she couldn't afford to waste. Gathering what little strength she had left, she activated a small device embedded in her suit, a holographic map projected from her wrist, displaying a network of tunnels and pathways that crisscrossed the canyon. One path led to a hidden outpost, an abandoned human colony that Ethan had mentioned earlier. She studied the map quickly, memorizing the route. "Ethan," she called softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him. "There is a way out. A safe path." Ethan peered out from his cover, breathing heavily. "Go," he shouted back. "I'll keep them distracted." "No." Lyran's voice was firm, despite her weakness. "You will not survive alone. We go together." Ethan hesitated, glancing at the approaching hovercrafts. He knew she was right, but he also knew their odds weren't great. Still, he couldn't abandon her, not after everything they'd been through. "All right," he said, running back to her. "Lead the way." With Lyran guiding him, they slipped away from the boulder and began navigating the narrow paths of the canyon. The mercenaries were relentless, their hovercrafts circling overhead and deploying more drones to track their movements. But the rocky terrain worked to their advantage, providing cover and making it difficult for the vehicles to follow. As they approached the entrance to another tunnel, The ground shook violently. A massive explosion rocked the canyon, sending a plume of smoke and fire into the sky. Ethan turned to see one of the mercenary hovercrafts spiraling out of control, its engine ablaze. A second explosion followed, taking out a drone. "Did you do that?" Ethan asked, his eyes wide. Laren managed a faint smile. "My suit has defenses." Ethan chuckled despite himself. "Remind me to ask about that later." They disappeared into the tunnel just as the remaining mercenaries regrouped. The sounds of pursuit faded as they ventured deeper into the labyrinth of rock, their path illuminated only by the faint glow of Laren's map. For now, they had escaped. But Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before the hunters caught up again. The real fight was still ahead. The secret revealed. The tunnel eventually opened into a cavern that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like jagged teeth, and the air was cool and damp. A faint blue glow came from bioluminescent plants clinging to the walls, casting eerie shadows. Ethan leaned against a rock, breathing heavily, while Laren slumped beside him, clutching the cylindrical device in her hands. They had been running for what felt like hours, dodging drones and mercenaries, and the weight of their flight was beginning to take its toll. "All right," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "We've got a moment to breathe. But I think it's time you tell me what we're really up against. What's in that thing?" He nodded toward the glowing device Laren held so protectively. Laren hesitated, her glowing eyes scanning his face. She seemed to wrestle with the decision before finally speaking. "This," she said, holding up the device, "is not just a cure. It's a weapon." Ethan froze. "A weapon? What kind of weapon?" Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "The sickness ravaging my people. It was engineered. A plague designed to target only Alsharans. This device contains the genetic blueprint for the virus, along with the antidote. With it, we can stop the plague, or reverse engineer it to make it harmless." Ethan's expression darkened. "You're telling me someone deliberately created a virus to wipe out your species?" She nodded. "The Syndicate, a coalition of powerful factions that view my people as a threat. We are warriors by nature, but we do not seek conquest. The Syndicate sees only what they fear." Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind racing. "So the mercenaries, they're working for the Syndicate?" "Yes," Laren said. "They want the device destroyed so we can never create a cure. But if it falls into the wrong hands, the virus could be unleashed on others." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "So it's not just your people at risk. This thing could wipe out entire civilizations." Laren nodded grimly. "That is why I took it. I couldn't let them keep such a weapon." Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to process everything. "You've got yourself into one hell of a mess," he said finally. "And now I'm in it with you." Laren's expression softened. "I am sorry for bringing this upon you. You didn't have to help me." Ethan shook his head. "You needed help. That's all that matters. But we got to figure out our next move. Fast. Those mercenaries aren't going to stop." He stood and began pacing, his mind working through their limited options. The abandoned human colony he'd mentioned earlier was still their best bet. It had been decommissioned years ago, but some of its systems might still be operational. If they could reach it, they might find a way to contact someone who could help or even set up a defensive perimeter. "All right," Ethan said. "The colony is about 10 kilometers from here. It's risky, but we've got no other choice. If we can get there, we might be able to hold them off long enough to come up with a plan." Laren nodded, her determination returning. "Then we move. We cannot let them take this." As they prepared to leave the cavern, a faint beeping sound caught Ethan's attention. He turned to see the cylindrical device glowing brighter, its light pulsing in rapid intervals. "What's it doing now?" he asked. Laren's eyes widened. "It's destabilizing." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked, his voice rising. "The sample inside. It's breaking down. If we don't get it to a secure environment soon, it could release the virus." Ethan swore under his breath. Great. As if we didn't have enough problems. They started down the winding path leading out of the cavern, moving as quickly as Lyran's injuries would allow. The device's beeping grew louder, a constant reminder of the ticking clock they now faced. As they neared the canyon's edge, the sound of engines roared once again, echoing through the rocky terrain. Ethan and Lyran ducked behind a cluster of boulders, peering out to see a squad of mercenaries approaching on sleek hoverbikes. The mercenaries were heavily armed, their black armor glinting under the pale light of Halora 7's twin moons. "They're sweeping the area," Ethan said. "We'll have to find another way around." Lyran's gaze shifted to a narrow, treacherous ledge running along the canyon wall. It was barely wide enough for a person to walk on, but it seemed to bypass the mercenaries entirely. "There," she said, pointing. Ethan followed her gaze and grimaced. "You've got to be kidding me. That's suicide. Do you have a better idea?" Lyran asked, her tone sharp despite her exhaustion. Ethan sighed. "All right, but if I fall and break my neck, I'm blaming you." They moved carefully onto the ledge, their backs pressed against the cold rock. The path was uneven, with loose stones threatening to give way beneath their feet. Below them, the canyon floor seemed impossibly far away. The mercenaries' voices grew louder as they drew closer, their searchlights sweeping the area. Ethan held his breath, praying they wouldn't look up. Just as they reached the halfway point, one of the stones beneath Lyran's foot crumbled, sending a cascade of pebbles tumbling into the canyon. The noise was subtle, but it was enough to draw the attention of the nearest mercenary. "There," one of them shouted, pointing toward the ledge. Ethan and Lyran broke into a sprint, the narrow path forcing them to move single file. Energy bolts sizzled through the air, striking the rock wall and sending fragments flying. The ledge shook with each impact, and Ethan could feel the ground shifting beneath him. "Go, go, go," he shouted, pushing Lyran forward. They reached the end of the ledge and jumped down onto a more stable path, just as the mercenaries reached their position. Ethan fired a few shots from his plasma pistol, forcing them to take cover, then grabbed Lyran's hand and pulled her toward the canyon's exit. As they ran, the cylindrical device in Lyran's hands pulsed brighter, its beeping reaching a frantic pitch. "We're running out of time," she said, her voice tight with fear. Ethan gritted his teeth. "Then let's make it count." The colony was close, but so were their enemies, and the danger was far from over. A desperate plan. Ethan and Lyran stumbled into the ruins of the abandoned human colony just as the last rays of Halora 7's twin moons bathed the desolate structures in pale light. The colony was a ghost town, its buildings crumbling under years of neglect. Rusted metal, shattered glass, and remnants of machinery littered the ground, giving the place an eerie, forgotten feel. "Not exactly welcoming," Ethan muttered, scanning the area. "But it'll have to do." Lyran was leaning heavily on him, her strength almost gone. The cylindrical device in her hands continued to pulse and beep, its glow now a harsh, unsteady light. "We don't have much time," she said weakly. Ethan guided her into the largest intact structure, a command center with thick, reinforced walls that had withstood the elements. Inside, the air was stale, and the dim emergency lights flickered intermittently. Dust coated every surface, but the building's layout was still functional. Ethan helped Lyran onto a metal bench and quickly set up a makeshift workspace. "All right," he said, rummaging through an old console. "If this place still has power, we might be able to use its defense systems. With a little luck, we can keep the mercenaries at bay long enough to stabilize that thing." Lyran nodded, but her expression was grim. "The Syndicate's forces are relentless. Even with defenses, they will find a way in." Ethan turned to her, his jaw tight. "Then we'll make them fight for every step." He activated the main console, which sputtered and flickered before coming to life. A grainy interface appeared, displaying the colony's layout. To his relief, the defense systems were still operational: turrets, energy shields, and proximity mines. They were outdated but functional, and with some manual overrides, he could control them from the command center. "Okay," Ethan said, more to himself than to Lyran. "This might just work." The plan takes shape. As Ethan worked on reactivating the defenses, Lyran studied the cylindrical device. Her glowing eyes were filled with a mixture of determination and fear. The beeping had slowed slightly, but the instability was still evident. "Can you stabilize it?" Ethan asked, glancing over his shoulder. Lyran nodded slowly. "I need access to a sterile environment, a containment field. The technology here is old, but it might suffice." Ethan pointed to a sealed lab at the back of the building. "That's your best bet. I'll hold them off while you work." Lyran hesitated. "Ethan, if the mercenaries breach the defenses, they cannot take this. You must destroy it before they do." Ethan frowned. "Destroy it? You just said this thing is your people's only hope." "It is," she said, her voice steady. "But in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon that could destroy countless lives. You must promise me." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but let's focus on keeping it out of their hands first." The siege begins. The first attack came just as Lyran activated the containment field in the lab. A deafening explosion echoed through the colony as the mercenaries' hovercrafts breached the perimeter. Ethan watched from the command console as the proximity mines he'd set up detonated, taking out 2 of the smaller vehicles. The turrets roared to life, firing streams of plasma at the approaching forces. "Come on," Ethan muttered, his fingers flying over the console. He directed the turrets to focus on the larger hovercraft, which was heavily armored and bristling with weapons. The vehicle dodged and weaved, returning fire and taking out one of the turrets with a well-placed shot. Inside the lab, Lyran worked with precision despite her exhaustion. The containment field hummed to life, and she placed the cylindrical device inside. A holographic interface projected above it, displaying complex data streams. She began manipulating the controls, her glowing eyes focused. Outside, the mercenaries advanced on foot, their black armor blending into the shadows. Ethan spotted them on the surveillance cameras and activated the colony's energy shields. A shimmering barrier enveloped the command center, deflecting the first wave of energy blasts. "That's right," Ethan muttered, his voice edged with defiance. "Come and get us." The mercenaries weren't deterred. They deployed drones that swarmed the shield, emitting high-pitched frequencies designed to destabilize it. Sparks flew as the barrier began to waver. Ethan cursed under his breath. "Lyran, how's it going in there?" Her voice crackled over the comms. "I stabilized the device for now, but it won't last. The containment field is barely holding." "Great," Ethan said, switching the turrets to manual control. He aimed carefully, taking out several drones with precise shots. But it wasn't enough. The mercenaries were closing in. The turning point. As the energy shield finally collapsed, the mercenaries launched their final assault. Explosions rocked the command center, and Ethan grabbed his plasma pistol, preparing for a fight. The first mercenary breached the door, and Ethan fired, hitting the figure square in the chest. The armored body slumped to the ground, but more followed. Ethan retreated into the lab, slamming the door shut and locking it. "We're out of time," he said, turning to Lyran. "Can you move?" Lyran shook her head, her body trembling. "The containment field must remain active. You need to leave." "I'm not leaving you," Ethan said firmly. He grabbed an old explosive charge from a supply crate and attached it to the lab's entrance. "If they get in here, I'll blow this place to hell." Lyran looked at him, her glowing eyes softening. "You are brave, Ethan Hayes. More than I could have hoped for." "Save it for when we survive this," Ethan said, checking the charge's timer. "Because if we don't, no one's going to remember either of us." The mercenaries pounding on the door grew louder. Ethan raised his pistol, his heart pounding as he prepared for the final stand. The roar of explosions outside the lab echoed through the room, and the faint hum of the containment field was the only constant sound. Ethan knew one thing. Whether they survived or not, they were going to make the syndicate pay dearly for this night. The final stand. The lab shook violently as another explosion rocked the command center. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. Ethan gritted his teeth, his plasma pistol aimed at the reinforced door. Outside, the mercenaries' pounding grew louder, the sound of their energy tools cutting through metal echoing like a countdown to doom. Lyran sat by the containment field, her silver hair glinting under the pale blue glow of the device. Her breathing was labored, her body pushed to its limits. The cylindrical device inside the containment field pulsed erratically, a grim reminder of how little time they had left. "They're almost in," Ethan said, his voice tight. "If we're going to make it out of here, it's now or never." Lyran's glowing eyes met his. "You must go, Ethan. Take the device and leave me." Ethan frowned, his jaw tightening. "Not happening. We started this together, and we're finishing it together." Lyran shook her head weakly. "The syndicate wants the device, not me. If I stay, I can delay them. You have the skill to deliver it to someone who can create the cure." Ethan's mind raced, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He knew she was right. If they both stayed, the syndicate would win. But leaving her behind, that wasn't a decision he was ready to make. "No," he said firmly. "We'll fight them off together. If we fail together." Before Lyran could respond, the door burst open with a deafening crash. Ethan fired immediately, his shots hitting the first mercenary square in the chest. The armored figure crumpled, but more poured in, their weapons blazing. Energy bolts tore through the lab, forcing Ethan to duck behind a console. "Lyran, stay down," he shouted, firing blindly over the top of his cover. The mercenaries advanced methodically, their black armor glinting in the flickering light. One of them threw an energy grenade, and Ethan barely managed to dive out of the way as it exploded, sending shards of metal and sparks flying. "We can't hold them much longer," Ethan yelled, his voice hoarse. Lyran's eyes narrowed. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she reached into her suit and activated a hidden mechanism. A holographic interface appeared on her wrist, displaying a complex sequence of symbols. She began inputting commands, her fingers trembling but precise. "What are you doing?" Ethan demanded, his gaze darting between her and the advancing mercenaries. "I'm activating the device's failsafe," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "If they breach the containment field, it will self-destruct." Ethan's eyes widened. "That thing will take us all out." Lyran nodded. "It's the only way to ensure they don't get it." Ethan swore under his breath. "You could have mentioned that earlier." The last gambit. The mercenaries pressed forward, their weapons tearing through Ethan's cover. He fired shot after shot, but it was clear they were overwhelming him. As one mercenary closed in, a plasma blade glowing red-hot in its hand, Ethan braced himself for the end. Then, with a sudden surge of energy, Lyran rose to her feet. Her glowing eyes blazed like twin stars, and a faint aura of light surrounded her. She extended her hand, and a burst of energy erupted from her palm, striking the mercenary and sending it flying across the room. Ethan stared in shock. "You could have done that this whole time." Lyran's lips curled into a faint smile. "It takes everything I have left." She unleashed another wave of energy, forcing the remaining mercenaries to retreat temporarily. But the effort left her staggering, her body visibly weakening. Ethan rushed to her side, catching her before she collapsed. "You can't keep this up," he said, his voice filled with worry. "I don't need to," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "The failsafe is almost ready. You must leave." Ethan shook his head. "Not without you." The mercenaries regrouped, their leader, a towering cyborg with glowing red eyes, stepping into the room. Its voice was cold and mechanical. "Surrender the device, and your deaths will be swift." Ethan aimed his pistol at the cyborg, his grip steady. "Come and take it. The cyborg raised its arm, a cannon emerging from its wrist. Before it could fire, Lyran unleashed one final surge of energy, shattering the cannon and sending the cyborg reeling. But the effort drained her completely, and she collapsed in Ethan's arms. "It's ready," she whispered. "Go." Ethan looked at the containment field, the device now glowing a dangerous red. The fail-safe countdown was displayed above it, 0130. He had 90 seconds to get out. "I'm not leaving you," Ethan said firmly, scooping her up. "Hold on." Escape and resolution. Ethan bolted from the lab, carrying Lyran as the mercenaries gave chase. The device's beeping grew louder, its countdown ticking away the seconds. Explosions rocked the command center as the containment field destabilized, the energy surges tearing through the structure. The cyborg leader barked orders, but it was too late. The fail-safe triggered, and a massive explosion erupted from the lab, engulfing the command center in a blinding flash of light. Ethan barely made it to the colony's edge before the shockwave hit, throwing him and Lyran to the ground. He shielded her with his body as debris rained down around them, the air thick with smoke and ash. When the dust settled, the command center was gone, a smoldering crater in its place. The mercenaries were obliterated, and the device, along with its dangerous secrets, was destroyed. Ethan looked down at Lyran, her glowing eyes flickering weakly. "We made it," he said softly. She gave him a faint smile. "Because of you." Ethan shook his head. "Because of us." He sat there for a long moment, holding her as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The Syndicate's weapon was gone, but Lyran's hope for her people remained. Together, they had survived the impossible. And maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to build something better.